When it comes to tank cannons, they always seem to get larger as time goes on. Limitations with existing calibers are met, so in order to keep ahead of armor, they have to keep expanding them. This isn't always the case though. In the 70s and 80s, the US tested a tank gun that would fire much faster, not much harder. This might seem like sort of an odd concept, but it did have some credibility. During that time frame, the Soviets far outnumbered NATO when it came to tanks. There were worries that if a war kicked off, Soviet tank forces would simply overwhelm NATO positions, with then current anti-tank weapons not having the speed to deal with them. Thus, the Medium Caliber Anti-Armor Automatic Cannon, or MCAAC, was born. The thinking was that they would create an anti-tank machine gun. And no, that isn't an exaggeration. They actually called it that. It wouldn't be as large as current guns like the 105 M68, but it would hit about just as hard, and fire at a much higher rate. This would, supposedly, allow them to countermass Soviet armor. It would be relatively low recoil and fire kinetic rounds. As for what vehicle would mount this type of gun, it was decided that lighter vehicles such as light tanks and AFVs would be ideal. These efforts began in 1973, with the Army creating a high-velocity 60mm gun. It used a combustible cartridge casing, which turned out to be a bit troublesome. The gun did have high performance, but there were some issues with parasitic sabot weight. Eventually, the concept moved to a 75mm gun, with legendary firearms designer Eugene Stoner being brought on. His new company, Ares Incorporated, would be in charge of the design and production process. In its original configuration, the gun used a sliding breech mechanism. This allowed it to fire 2 rounds per second, but it wasn't very reliable. It was soon redesigned, now having a rotating push-through breech mechanism. Both versions use case-telescoped ammunition, where the projectile is fully embedded in the case. With the push-through breech, this ammo type was used to its full potential. With tank rounds, you wouldn't normally want to ram the spent casing out with the new round, as it could damage the sabot, but the end caps in the CTA rounds permitted this. This method of loading greatly simplified the process. It also gave the gun some unique capabilities. Normally, if a tank has an automatic loader, the gun has to return to a loading position, as if the breech is at an angle, it becomes very difficult to load. This wasn't an issue with the 75, also known as the Super 75. The Super 75 could load at any angle, as the breech was mounted along the trunnion line. This means that as the gun assembly moves, the breech stays in the same place. So regardless of the elevation, when it has to load a new round, all it has to do is spin until it hits the load position. The new round would be rammed upwards, pushing the spent casing up and out the other end of the breech. In addition to being extremely reliable, this also allowed for very high degrees of gun depression and elevation. Though originally envisioned as an anti-armor tool, it was soon realized that it would be an amazing multi-role weapon. Eventually, proximity-fused ammunition was developed for it, allowing it to engage aircraft. It was also believed it could be used in the indirect fire role. With its high rate of fire and high elevation, this does seem plausible. As for the gun's anti-tank performance, results seem to be quite promising. During firing tests undertaken in 1979, it was discovered that the gun's round was pretty much equal to XM774, the M68's latest round. XM774, which would enter service the next year, could penetrate about 375mm of RHA. When you remember that you're getting that kind of performance out of a 75, it is quite impressive, especially when you consider the fire rate. In its final configuration, the gun fired at 70 RPM, or 1 round every 0.85 seconds. Though the 75 could deal with tanks in one shot, it would fire in 2 or 3 round bursts. This was to raise the PK, or probability of kill. Contrary to popular belief, the gun was not intended to shred armor with multiple hits. It also wasn't inaccurate. Its accuracy was on par with the M68, which was a pretty accurate gun. The final round developed for the 75, Delta 6, could penetrate around 430mm of RHA. Though this may seem like a lot, it was ultimately deemed inadequate, as due to recent advances in Soviet armor, it was no longer guaranteed that it could destroy all Soviet tanks from the front. Tanks like the T-72, T-62, and T-55 were still fair game, but for tanks like the T-80, it was a toss-up. Very few tank engagements take place directly head-to-head, and firing a burst at a tank is likely to break something, but the Army decided it wasn't good enough. The M68 could still have some performance squeezed out of it, which led to the round M900. A 90mm version of the gun was briefly considered, and likely would have been on par with M900, but the program had already used so much money. There were other considerations as well. The Marine Corps also believed that if the gun went up in size, vehicles bearing it would not be air transportable. There were also questions about the gun's ability to engage fortifications. During testing, the gun did not do well against bunkers. AAI, who made several vehicles housing the gun, believed that they could take down bunkers, but simply by shooting it more. This reasoning was obviously not accepted. Though I believe the Army's requirements were too harsh, it is easy to see where they were coming from. Despite the M551 Sheridan shortcomings, it was liked for one thing, its ability to get rid of fortifications. For airborne forces, they didn't want to lose that capability. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.